I am Alden Windrow, and today I'm going to be talking about John Kennedy Toole's A Confederacy of Dunces. Tragically, Toole could never get his novel published during his lifetime and ended up taking his own life in 1969 at the age of 32. In the aftermath of his death, his mother, Thelma Toole, made it her mission to find a publisher for the book. However, there are accounts that Toole had a complicated and sometimes difficult relationship with his mother. While supportive of his writing, she was also reportedly quite controlling and strict in some respects. After his death, she dedicated years to finding a publisher and promoting his work. One may ask why Toole couldn't ever get his novel published. His novel was rejected by major publishers, and one prominent rejection came from Robert Gottlieb, who didn't see the point of the book, saying it lacked a clear purpose or reason beyond the cleverness. The novel itself was a hard sell due to its dense satirical style, rooted in New Orleans' unique culture, its inability to fit neatly into a genre, and its unconventional main character, Ignatius J. Reilly. I think there is some value in questioning what the point of the book is. Does the book have an actual message, or is it just for entertainment? Part of what makes this question so difficult to answer is that while the novel is satirical, it's hard to confirm that the main character is a genius of greater intelligence than the rest of the world of dunces, as is suggested in the opening quote by Jonathan Swift that says, quote, "When a true genius appears in the world, you may know him by this sign that the dunces are all in confederacy against him." But we can never confirm the genius of Ignatius, but only catch glimpses of possibilities in Toole's otherwise dysfunctional misfit character. In my reading of this, I could never be sure Ignatius was actually a genius, or if the satire was supposed to be of someone caught in delusions of imagining they are a misunderstood genius. I think there's a little bit of both, and because of that, it's more difficult to figure out who exactly the target of satire is in this book. While there are definitely some interesting characters around Ignatius, we cannot simply dismiss them all as dunces, and what is more obvious are the ways in which Ignatius misperceives the world around him. Despite the book's title, we cannot simply say that the story fulfills the quote of Jonathan Swift, but is instead a tongue-in-cheek nod to the quote. Instead of fulfilling the truth of Swift's quote, the novel complicates it, raising questions about the kind of perspective that reduces people to labels like geniuses and dunces. The only thing certain about the book is that it's funny and has a certain cultural charm to it that I found really enjoyable. We get a sense of Ignatius' critical attitude toward the world around him as we see him with the odd green hunting cap on his head, where outside D.H. Holmes' department store, his, quote, supercilious blue and yellow eyes looked down upon the other people waiting under the clock. He studies the other people around him, judging their outfits, considering some as offenses against taste and decency. And this is just beyond poor taste in Ignatius' view. It's a much more serious matter as, quote, possession of anything new or expensive only reflected a person's lack of theology and geometry. It could even cast doubts upon one's soul. And so already in the first paragraph of the book, we get a good sense that there is something off with Ignatius' point of view. He's highly judgmental, looking for things that might offend him so that he might feel superior to them. In Ignatius' view, everything is overly offensive to absurd levels, including canned food, which Ignatius calls a perversion, suspecting it of being, quote, damaging to the soul. Ignatius is obviously not a dunce, as we learned that he graduated from college and has a master's degree. Unfortunately, his smarts do not translate into real-world success since he has no interest in the working world. His mother complains to Darlene, who works at the Night of Joy. Quote, I spent all his poor Grandma Reilly's insurance money to keep him in college for 8 years, and since then all he's done is lay around the house watching television. When I hear stories like this, especially comparing it to today's college graduate, it doesn't surprise me all that much because the working world offers no meaningful intellectual challenge to someone like Ignatius. It's better to just stay home and watch TV. While he's waiting for his mother, who is still inside the department store, he stands holding some sheet music for his trumpet playing and a new string for his lute. We never really learn whether or not he's actually good at playing these instruments, but based on his next door neighbor Annie, who constantly complains about the noise coming from Reilly's home, I can only imagine it must not sound too good, and even a well played trumpet can be aggravating to neighbors. Police Officer Mancuso, somewhat like the New Orleans version of Barney Fife, is on a mission to find anyone that looks suspicious, targeting Ignatius standing in the crowd like a quote, great woolly tanker. He generally harasses Ignatius, asking for his identification, hoping that Ignatius doesn't have any. If there's anyone that fulfills the definition of a dunce, it's Officer Mancuso, whom John Kennedy Toole ridicules throughout the book, making a mockery of the man who was made by the sergeant to disguise himself in ridiculous outfits in hopes of catching criminal activity on the streets or wherever he could find them. Ignatius tells the officer to go away, seeing him as nothing more than a pest, calling him stupid for questioning the lute string hanging from his bag. Quote, let me see your driver's license. I don't drive. Will you kindly go away? I am waiting for my mother. What's this hanging out of your bag? What do you think it is, stupid? It's a string for my lute. Ignatius further goes on to criticize the police department in general, accusing them of giving protection to the real criminals while harassing easy targets who stand out in the crowd like Ignatius. The altercation gets physical when Mancuso grabs Ignatius by the arm. Ignatius strikes his cap with sheet music and whips him on the ear with his lute string. By the time his mother comes out of the department store, there is a whole crowd of people surrounding the altercation, with Ignatius threatening to contact the mayor, outraged as Mancuso attempts to take Ignatius away to the precinct. The crowd transforms into a mob, sharing in the outrage Ignatius experiences, calling out the injustice of the police department's actions against the innocent citizens, as the old man in the crowd says, quote, a good boy can't even wait for his mama by D.H. Holmes. It's the communists. I think Toole here, while capturing the outraged sentiment of the crowd, also takes a jab at people who think like this, calling anyone they find fault with a communist, but misspelling the word to make it seem like a ridiculous and baseless accusation. You better watch out who you calling a communist, Mancuso retorts to the old man. The crowd then starts defending the old man, a woman screaming at dirty cop Mancuso to leave the old man alone. Ignatius' mother joins in the accusations that the police are good for nothing, harassing her, quote, child, her 30-year-old son. What you trying to do to my poor child? Mrs. Reilly asked the policeman. Ignatius patted his mother's hennaed hair with one of his huge paws. You got plenty business picking on poor children with all the kind of people they got running in this town, waiting for his mama, and they try to arrest him. It's the communists, the old man interrupted. We start getting more insight into Ignatius when Mancuso questions if he has a job. I dust a bit, Ignatius told the policeman. In addition, I am at the moment writing a lengthy indictment against our century. When my brain begins to reel from my literary labors, I make an occasional cheese dip. So we find out early on that Ignatius isn't really interested in joining the labor force. He has more important work to do. But even this is somewhat in question as to whether or not his writings are truly more important or whether his critiques of society are valid simply because it's hard to trust Ignatius' unreliable judgments based on his inability to see the rest of the world as anything less than inferior to himself. The menial jobs he eventually ends up taking on show that maybe they aren't really worth doing to begin with. And so this is another gray area where it's uncertain as to whether or not his writings offer more value to society than working the 9 to 5. Even though Ignatius has fair grounds to claim harassment, he nonetheless uses the old man as a scapegoat, saying he started the entire thing. We learn early on that Ignatius doesn't have the greatest moral compass, trying to get out of situations by shifting the blame elsewhere instead of standing his ground and taking responsibility for his actions. By blaming the old man, the blame is taken off of Mancuso, causing Mrs. Reilly to begin scolding the old man while admitting that she falls on her knees every night to, quote, "Thank my God we got protection. We'd all be dead without the police." This creates a sudden change in the tune of the entire scene, with another woman chiming in that it's the truth that they'd all have their throats cut without police protection. Once the blame is shifted, Mancuso grabs the old man roughly after being called a communist one too many times. "Oh my God," Ignatius said, watching the wan little policeman try to control the old man. "Now my nerves are totally frayed." And so Ignatius, now off the hook, escapes with his mother and her cake boxes to a bar called Night of Joy. This is where we catch the first hints that Mrs. Reilly might have a drinking problem as she drinks her beer in gulps, listening to Ignatius talk about the one time he left New Orleans for Baton Rouge on a Greyhound Cine-Cruiser, a specific model of Greyhound buses introduced in the 1950s. As Mrs. Reilly's attention wavers between the beer and her son's story that she's heard him tell for 3 years, Ignatius explains with exaggeration that the bus ride was like, quote, hurtling into the abyss. The bus ride proves to be a waste of time as he goes for a job interview without wearing a tie, and the interviewer, the chairman of the medieval culture department, makes a smirky remark about his lumber jacket and how he didn't wear a tie. Ignatius, of course, takes offense, not seeing any need to make a good impression at the interview. "I was appalled that so meaningless a person would dare such effrontery." We start to see the pattern of Ignatius reducing everyone around him to lesser beings than himself. The chairman, basically what we might refer to today as an NPC. From Ignatius' perspective, he is the main player in a world full of non-player characters. He judges Night of Joy harshly, claiming that he and his mother are probably catching something from the glasses, and when the bartender asks Ignatius for the ending to his story, he is harshly rebuked by Ignatius. "Will you kindly tend the bar properly?" Ignatius asked furiously. "It is your duty to silently serve when we call upon you. If we had wished to include you in our conversation, we would have indicated it by now. As a matter of fact, we are discussing rather urgent personal matters." Meanwhile, his mother continues to order more beers, which we gradually learn is her unhealthy way of coping with having a son like Ignatius. In the next scene, we meet another very interesting and funny character by the name of Jones, who is in the precinct on a bench with the others, described as mostly shoplifters. He asks the old man, known as Mr. Robichaud, what he's in for, and talks about how if he had called the policeman a communist, they probably would send him to Angola, the Louisiana State Penitentiary. Jones, perhaps more than any character in the novel, may be the true genius, pointing out where the injustices of society truly lie. It is in the precinct that Jones first hears about Ignatius, the quote, big fat man dressed funny, and a quote, big pervert, according to Mancuso. A pervert, huh? The sergeant asked greedily. Yes, Mancuso said with new confidence. A great big prevert. You could say that all of the characters in the novel are greatly exaggerated in the same way that Mancuso describes Ignatius. This effect has the feeling of reading the characters in the novel as larger than life caricatures in a satirical cartoon. When they leave Night of Joy, Mrs. Reilly, having had one too many drinks, backs their Plymouth into another car. Her emotional state at this point is not too good as she tells Ignatius to shut up as he's making her nervous. It's funny that Ignatius chooses to sit in the back seat of the car as if his mother was a chauffeur, his reasoning being that he once read that the front passenger seat of the car was the most dangerous. It's just another example of how peculiar and often self centered his habits can be. Not long afterwards, Mrs. Reilly drives out of the parking lot and skids into the post of a building, crunching the Plymouth. Oh my God, Ignatius screamed from the rear. What have you done now? Call a priest. I don't think that we're injured, Mother. However, you have just ruined my stomach for the next few days. Ignatius has this issue with his stomach that he constantly refers to as his valve, which I figured out means the opening from his stomach into his intestines, also known as the pyloric sphincter. Most of this valve problem he has is likely imagined or psychosomatic rather than a confirmed medical condition. His eyes are described as a strange yellow and blue color. I'm not really sure if that has to do with jaundice, but it suggests a sickliness added to his oddball appearance. We get an inside look at Ignatius' bedroom where he does his writing on comparative history that he thinks will show, quote, literate men the disaster course that history has been taking for the past 4 centuries. And this is where we start to see Ignatius' delusions of grandeur, as we also learn that he only writes about 6 paragraphs per month on Big Chief writing tablets that are mostly filled with doodles. Throughout the novel, Ignatius often invokes Fortuna, the blind goddess who spins us on a wheel, as referenced by the writings of Boethius, who laid down the foundation of medieval thought in The Consolation of Philosophy. He wonders if the car accident is the beginning of a bad cycle with the wheel, quote, rapidly spinning downward. Fortuna becomes a kind of emotional crutch and a way of making sense of his bad fortune, not to mention it's his last effort to put to use his medieval education. I suspect Toole was trying to make a point about the uselessness of such degrees in the real world, showing Ignatius' vain attempts to make the world he doesn't fit into make sense, all the while dodging any personal responsibility for his misfortunes. In one scene, he is in his bedroom praying to Fortuna. O Fortuna, blind, heedless goddess, I am strapped to your wheel, Ignatius belched. Do not crush me beneath your spokes. Raise me on high, divinity. What you mumbling about in there, boy? His mother asked through the closed door. I am praying, Ignatius answered angrily. He accuses his mother of shattering his religious ecstasy. His mom thinks he's praying to God and asks for a Hail Mary since Patrolman Mancuso is coming to see her about the accident. The story switches back and forth between Ignatius and Jones. We find out that Jones ends up taking a job working for Lana Lee, the manager at Night of Joy, with the pay of only $20 a week. He wonders aloud what happened to the, quote, minimal wage. He seems to only take this insultingly low-paying job in order to keep himself out of trouble with the police. Eventually, though, he sees little point in the menial job of sweeping and doesn't make much effort allowing the floors to remain dirty because it's just not worth it. The piles of dust on the floor are like little rebellions against Lana Lee and her stingy attitude toward him. In one scene, he asks Lana if she has ever tried to live on the amount of money he makes. Of course, she never has, and nor does she care. She simply rubs it in his face that he should be thankful she got him off the streets by offering him a job. Meanwhile, she plans a secret scheme to distribute pornographic photos, disguising them with educational materials such as a book, a, which happens to be a copy of Ignatius, The Consolation of Philosophy, which travels around from Mancuso to George, and also a used globe. She stores these props in a cabinet, but the underpaid Jones has his eyes on her, looking for any opportunity to strike back at her for her mistreatment of him. He starts to suspect something is up with her business of, quote, helping the orphans, which he starts to call her out on, threatening to report her to the police once he figures out what she's really up to. As we learn the details of the setting of the story, it also reveals a lot about the trajectory of Ignatius' life. Ignatius lives with his mother on Constantinople Street in a declining neighborhood of houses built in the 1880s and 90s. Quote, it was a neighborhood that had degenerated from Victorian to nothing in particular, a block that had moved into the 20th century carelessly and uncaringly and with very limited funds. This setting suggests the holding on to values from the past as they decay, Ignatius being the medievalist misfit, no longer a valued or productive member of society, but someone the world no longer appreciates, his education of no real merit. And the fact that the declining neighborhood is degenerating from a particular era to, quote, nothing in particular also suggests a loss of cultural relevance or set of values, a developing lostness of an ill-defined American culture. Ignatius embodies more of a Victorian mindset when it comes to morals, such as the strict code of morality and the propriety of the Victorian era, with an emphasis on modesty, decorum, and a strong sense of order and discipline. Although Ignatius upholds these values, he is unable to fully realize or embody them in a practical way. He can only eulogize about them while frittering away his time on meager writings while criticizing the movies and TV shows he watches. Ignatius himself is like that decaying Victorian home, a once stately property suffering from neglect that can no longer be publicly funded or restored to its original beauty and grandeur. It's no surprise that the rest of the story boils down to a lack of money to pay for the property damage after the car accident. And since his mother has no money to pay for it, she insists on Ignatius finding a job in the real world, but there are no jobs out there that he wants to do. The only job he ever held before the accident was with the New Orleans Public Library for only 2 weeks. And being the eccentric that he is, he couldn't just paste the slips into library books, but had to develop his own aesthetic about them, only pasting in 3 or 4 slips per day. The library lets him go and even revokes his library card for being such a bad employee. He explains that the problem, quote, employers sensed in me a denial of their values. They fear me. I suspect that they can see that I am forced to function in a century which I loathe. He tells his mother that she should confess her sins for the predicament of him having to find a real job while, quote, delaying the completion of a monumental indictment against our society. Sounds like the type of writing I would appreciate, but unfortunately, our society is run by money, and it does become a preoccupation and barrier to the kind of creative intellectual work that Ignatius wants to do, however undisciplined he is in the completion of that work. That's why I can't really take Ignatius seriously, because he never really applies himself to the work that matters to him with any serious effort. His ambitions are all in his head, never to be fully expressed on the pages of his big chief tablets. Talking with Mancuso, Ignatius' mother finds out that the owner of the damaged property wants a settlement. And notice how she calls Mancuso honey and babe, as if trying to coax some favorable news from him. What he said, honey? I told him I investigated the accident and that you just skidded on a wet street. That sounds good. So what he said then, babe? He said he don't want to go to court. He wants a settlement now. Oh my God, Ignatius bellowed from the front of the house. What an egregious insult to good taste. Ignatius is actually responding to a TV show he's watching that contains frantic music and a, quote, chorus of falsettos singing insinuatingly about loving all night long. Do I believe the total perversion that I am witnessing? If what he was watching back then was what he considered perverse, I can only imagine how he'd respond to what is considered entertainment today, with performers strutting around in their underwear. So I can somewhat appreciate Ignatius' desire for propriety in one's culture, but he goes too far with it, making his obsession for decency habitual, a constant complaint over every little thing that offends his sense of taste. The absurd comedy continues when he criticizes a commercial for acne cream. I would like very much to know what the founding fathers would say if they could see these children being debauched to further the cause of clearasil. However, I always suspected that democracy would come to this. A firm rule must be imposed upon our nation before it destroys itself. The United States needs some theology and geometry, some taste and decency. I suspect that we are teetering on the edge of the abyss. Again, I don't totally disagree with Ignatius' longing for a culture where people have a sense of decency, but compared to today, I would say those times are long gone. Taste and decency are no longer landmarks of American culture. However, I suspect that there were always people like Ignatius who saw themselves as above the times they lived in. His invoking of the founding fathers seems like a waste of breath, since none of his opinions seem to carry any weight. He writes in his big chief tablet about the horrors of television and how if the medieval nun Heroswitha was with us today, we would all look to her for counsel and guidance. It's as if he's still in grad school writing papers on obscure medieval figures, but the problem is there is no one to read or appreciate his writings. And so Ignatius manages to land a job at Levy Pants, which sounds maybe like one of Levi's Pants' lesser known competitors. The manager, Mr. Gonzalez, is so desperate for help that they practically hire Ignatius without an interview, not really knowing what they are in for. Ignatius schemes in his writings to become an undercover observer and critic of his employer, which he sees as part of the system. He considers Mr. Gonzalez a, quote, cretin, despite his being a pleasant person to work for. In one scene where Ignatius is trying to use a stool for filing, he is described as, quote, an eggplant balanced atop a thumbtack. And when he tries to travel on the wheeled stool, one of the wheels gets lodged in a crack, sending Ignatius to the floor. Oh my God, I think I've broken my back. He threatens to sue Gonzalez when he tries to help him up from the floor. Trixie, the old woman who works there and who somehow thinks that Ignatius' name is Gloria, attempts to help him back up, but she falls over too. And then Mr. Levy walks in to see this comical scene, saying, "What are you people doing down there on the floor?" Mr. Levy, though, does not like visiting the office and is eager to get out of there as soon as possible. He doesn't care at all about the people who work there, only to check and see if he has any personal mail. Ignatius gets himself and the company into hot water by forging a letter from Mr. Levy to one of their distributors, Abelman's Dry Goods, who apparently had an issue with their trousers. We do not wish to be bothered in the future by such tedious complaints. Please confine your correspondence to orders only. We are a busy and dynamic organization whose mission, needless effrontery and harassment, can only hinder. If you molest us again, sir, you may feel the sting of the lash across your pitiful shoulders. Ignatius tears up the letter Mr. Gonzalez writes, slipping his own in. In his deluded plan, he believes that this letter will be a show of strength and force that will somehow put Abelman's Dry Goods in their place. And later in the novel, Abelman responds with a libel suit for $500,000, forcing Mr. Levy to track down the perpetrator of the letter. And in a comical scene where he searches for Abelman's folder, he finds the drawer completely empty since Ignatius simply dumps all the files. What do you people do with the filing? I was wondering about that myself, Ignatius' replacement, Mr. Zalatimo, says. Ignatius arrives at the office an hour late every day so that he can be, quote, more rested and refreshed when he arrives, which he claims increases the quality of his work. He clearly doesn't fit in with the corporate work culture or its values, instead opting for whatever suits his personal preferences. Despite his claim that he's going to work like an undercover agent, he shows that he has no concept of what that means, pitting himself against the company he works for and making his inability to fit in there obvious. And one of the most ridiculous and inappropriate things he does in the office is to put up a cross as if to impose a sense of the religious, or what he calls a, quote, spiritual dimension into the work setting. Miss Trixie, who doesn't seem to know who she is or what time of day it is, kneels under the cross and prays there. The only thing the cross lacks is, quote, God and commerce, which Ignatius had ready to apply across the bottom of the cross. However, Mr. Gonzalez, who is so afraid of getting into any kind of trouble or losing what little help he has in Ignatius, never has a problem with the cross being up in the office saying, quote, isn't that fine? Studying the cross with tired eyes. He even encourages Ignatius to go find, quote, social justice in the factory while his valve is operating. Ignatius writes, any connection between American art and American nature is purely coincidental, but this is only because the nation as a whole has no contact with reality. That is only one of the reasons why I have always been forced to exist on the fringes of its society, consigned to the limbo reserved for those who do not know reality when they see it. Although Ignatius claims to be a spokesperson for reality, his actions prove otherwise. Whatever he writes cannot be taken to be serious literature since it carries no real weight, nor is it backed up by his actions. We can only laugh at Ignatius' deluded mindset of being someone who represents reality. Just because he exists on the fringes of society does not mean he's a genius or that he has a better grasp of reality than everyone else. But his writings reinforce his own delusions of grandeur as he writes himself as a misunderstood social justice warrior waiting for his time to have his voice heard in the world to set it straight. And so Toole, using Ignatius as an example, ridicules those who position themselves as morally superior to everyone else, including the middle class, who Ignatius sees as the spiritually bankrupt and culturally ignorant. If a middle-class white was suicidal enough to sit next to me, I imagine that I would beat him soundly about the head and shoulders with one great hand, tossing quite deftly one of my Molotov cocktails into a passing bus jammed with middle-class whites with the other hand. It is odd that He thinks so poorly of the middle class, not thinking about the political ramifications of eliminating the middle class, which would make him, in effect, a communist. But in other scenes, he declares himself not a communist. I'm not sure if that's simply due to the lingering effects of McCarthyism, that the word has such a negative connotation that he doesn't want to be associated with, or if he simply doesn't fully understand the ways in which his point of view does align with a potentially socialist, if not fully communist viewpoint. In a conversation with Mr. Clyde, he claims that he wants a king to run the country. What I want is a good, strong monarchy with a tasteful and decent king who has some knowledge of theology and geometry and to cultivate a rich inner life. A king? You want a king? Oh, stop babbling at me. I never heard of nobody wanted a king. Not being able to see beyond his hatred for modernity, Ignatius longs for the idealistic olden days where kings ruled and traditions are upheld. Another of his delusions is thinking that he shares a great deal in common with the black community, seeing himself in the same shared outsider space beyond the, quote, inner realm of American society. His mistake is in taking action based on this delusion as he attempts to use the factory of Levy Pants, where many blacks are employed, as a proving ground for social justice. He imagines, based on his plan to free the factory workers, that, quote, one of the more powerful civil rights organizations will no doubt cover me with laurels. And so, after acquainting himself with the factory workers, he gets them to agree with his plan to protest Levy Pants with a camera in his hand to film the whole thing. The plan goes horribly wrong, though, as the workers find themselves confused as to what it is Ignatius wants them to do or what the protest riot is supposed to accomplish, as he leads them from the factory and into the main office where justice will supposedly be served. Miss Trixie is confused, wondering if it's a minstrel show with the factory workers singing about Jesus, and Mr. Gonzalez is also confused, not understanding what it all means. Ignatius then, the voice of the factory workers, says, "Do you refuse to help these people?" "Help them?" the officer manager asked in a frightened voice. "What are you talking about, Mr. Reilly?" "I am talking about the sin against society of which you are guilty." He then orders the people to attack, but that only results in a bicycle chain half-heartedly knocking over the bean plants, much to the chagrin of Ignatius. The workers are cautious of obeying Ignatius once they hear he is wanted by the police, so the whole plan fails miserably. They all return to the factory, Ignatius' delusions of being a white savior and social justice warrior shattered. This scene highlights the danger in having a privileged outsider presume to speak for marginalized groups without any real understanding based on lived experience. This, of course, ends his employment as he is fired from Levy Pants. And when Ignatius hits the street again to look for another job, he ends up at Paradise Vendors, where he finds an old man by the name of Mr. Clyde whistling Turkey in the Straw while boiling hot dogs. Of course, Ignatius has to give his opinion of the man's choice of tune while eating one of his hot dogs. "I suspect that you imagine Turkey in the Straw to be a valuable bit of Americana. Well, it is not. It is a discordant abomination. I can't see that it matters much. It matters a great deal, sir. Veneration of such things as Turkey in the Straw is at the very root of our current dilemma." Ignatius never turns down an opportunity to illustrate his superior artistic and cultural tastes, no matter how misplaced they are, which is his whole dilemma. With no place for him in the world, he is forced to throw his pearls before swine, hoping that someone will appreciate his pearls of wisdom and good taste. In order to pay for the hot dog, he ends up taking a job selling hot dogs for Paradise vendors, and his new employment begins. The first thing he does after turning the corner with a hot dog cart is to make a hot dog for himself and eats it ravenously. And then he meets George, a high school dropout who works undercover for Lana Lee. George demands a hot dog, but Ignatius will not make him one. And after ramming the cart into George's crotch, George calls him crazy and disappears. It's here that we overhear a group of women refer to hot dog vendors as bums and winos. Quote, "They shouldn't let people like him out on the street," one woman says, referring to Ignatius. And when he returns to the garage, he tells Mr. Clyde he was robbed and held at gunpoint. According to Ignatius, they took no money, but he claims they stole all the hot dogs that he actually ate. I do often feel bad for Mrs. Reilly as she argues with Ignatius in the bathtub about his not being able to hold down an office job while having to endure the embarrassment of him, quote, selling weenies on the street. Ignatius says, "You're looking rather peaked these days." "Of course I am, boy. You breaking your poor mama's heart. What would you do if I dropped dead?" She sees Ignatius' potential as wasted and all the money she spent on his college being flushed down the drain. Back on the job again, Ignatius, now dressed as a pirate, comically takes his hot dog cart to a place where no people are, instead making friends with a cat. Quote, "It was a rather appealing calico. I offered it a hot dog. However, the cat refused to eat it. It was an animal with some taste and decency." It's just another instance where Ignatius can't even fit into the role of a hot dog vendor and has to turn it into an opportunity to be a misfit, somehow failing to even sell hot dogs, something that you wouldn't think would be too difficult to sell. So Mr. Clyde sends him to the French Quarter to sell hot dogs, which Ignatius finds appalling, of course. "If you insist, I imagine that I shall have to trundle my Franks down into Sodom and Gomorrah." He sees the tourists there as degenerates, but really Ignatius is no better than any of them, which is the tragic irony of his existence, upholding virtue while not showing any of it in his behavior. But his ego is too great for him to actually see his own hypocrisy. In another comic scene, he criticizes the art exhibit displayed by the Ladies' Art Guild in Pirates Alley. "Oh my God," Ignatius bellowed after he had promenaded up and down along the fence. "How dare you present such abortions to the public?" Ignatius, of course, has to take on the role of art critic, saying that they need a course in botany since they don't know how to properly paint magnolias. They are offended by this freak hot dog vendor, and the spokeswoman asks him to leave. Throwing a rock at his head, they see him as nothing more than an offensive, low-class degenerate himself, mirroring how Ignatius often sees the rest of the world around him. And then he runs into a character known as the young man who early in the story buys a hat from Mrs. Reilly. They have a minor physical altercation where Ignatius breaks his sword on his sweater, but after talking with him a while about the possibilities of war being turned into a masquerade for opposing armies to have dances and balls, he begins to think the young man may offer a way to, quote, assault the effrontery of M. Minkoff. "Perhaps you are the hope for the future," Ignatius said, dramatically pounding one paw into the other. "There certainly doesn't seem to be anything else very promising on the horizon." With the hopes of forming a new political party, he accepts an invitation to a party at the young man's home. Ignatius feels understood by the young man, who goes by the alias of Dorian Green, perhaps a nod to Oscar Wilde's Dorian Gray, which may reveal something more about the young man, but Ignatius still criticizes him for his, quote, vulgarly effeminate facade. He doesn't seem to really understand what he's getting into by going to this party, thinking it will be an opportunity to organize serious political action, a quote, kickoff rally. Later in his writings, he reveals that while he still considers Dorian a morally inferior degenerate whom he takes advantage of to, quote, save the world through degeneracy, this is in alignment with his desire to change society by working with those who, quote, eschew the philosophy of the middle class. In short, what he hopes for is peace through degeneracy. But again, this is another example of him misappropriating causes he doesn't truly understand or align with for a sense of personal gain while trying to have a meaningful impact on the world around him. When he arrives at the party, he realizes his mistake, saying, I can see that we're going to have a great deal of trouble capturing the conservative rural redneck Calvinist vote. He can't compete with the phonograph, as no one really wants to listen to his speech before he is chased out of the place after referring to them as sodomites. When they turn the music back on, Ignatius feels invisible and pretends to duel with an imaginary opponent with his cutlass sword to make him feel less self-conscious. It's a sad scene that really highlights his alienation from every aspect of society, including others who might also be said to be misfits. Meanwhile, we continue to get more insight into the personal life of Mr. Levy, who constantly argues with his wife, who sees him as having wasted the inheritance of his father's business in Levy's pants. But he sees the product they make as inferior and out of touch with the times, the business itself one that he would rather sell off than put any effort towards maintaining. Christ, who wants that old factory? Nobody's buying the kind of pants they make anymore. He blames his father, whom he refers to as a tyrant, for dismissing every good idea he had to offer, quote, just to prove that he was the father and I was the son. In one scene, as Mr. Levy is trying to solve the mystery of the forged letter, we get an insight into his thinking, which only shows that nobody is immune to the negative influences of corporate structures, including the owners. Quote, just come near Levy Pants and you were subjected to all sorts of annoyances and depressing influences. You couldn't leave the place alone for a minute. Anyone who wanted to take it easy and not be bothered had better not have a company like Levy Pants. We do learn at the end that Mr. Levy does keep the factory open for the sake of Mr. Gonzalez, thinking he might unalive himself if he ever shut the factory down. I don't think Mr. Levy could live with himself if that happened. While Mr. Levy is a flawed character, he does at least show a little bit of a moral conscience. I wonder how many business owners and CEOs today ever think there might be a, quote, human life to consider when laying off their workers. We also meet Santa, a friend of Mrs. Reilly's, who frequently offers criticism of Ignatius. Mrs. Reilly confides in her, saying, when we used to come home with all them little holy pictures, Mrs. Reilly sniffed, I sure never thought then he'd end up selling weenies in the broad daylight. Santa tries to set up Mrs. Reilly with the old man from the beginning scene of the book named Mr. Robichaud, since he apparently has money. Her whole plan is to encourage Mrs. Reilly to put Ignatius into a mental hospital so she doesn't have to deal with him anymore, and getting hooked up with Mr. Robichaud so she won't have to worry about money anymore. At Santa's, they have a conversation where Mrs. Reilly drinks whiskey and bursts into tears, which Mr. Robichaud finds confusing, not realizing that the emotional trauma she endures watching her son's life degenerate. Oh, don't cry, Mr. Robichaud pleaded, completely confused by the tragic turn the evening was apparently taking. I gotta do something. I gotta call the authorities to come take that boy away, Mrs. Reilly sobbed. She paused to take a mouthful of early times. Maybe they put him in a detention home or something. Ain't he 30 years old? My heart's broke. Ain't he writing something? Some foolishness nobody never gonna feel like reading. And there we have a hint of what the real life relationship between Toole and his mother must have been like, with his writings never amounting to anything during his lifetime. It's the same for Ignatius, who, despite esteeming his writings as being of high value and importance, is not taken seriously by anyone else except maybe insultingly by Myrna. Mr. Robichaud suggests that maybe Ignatius stayed in school too long. When they go to the movies, Mrs. Reilly can't even enjoy the movie, her mind on, quote, Ignatius' rapidly decreasing salary, the payment on the trumpet, the payment on the wrecked building, the earring, and the sign. Her problems and her son are, quote, really the same thing. And meanwhile, Santa comments over the ridiculously superficial aspects of the movie, the, quote, cute dress happening on the screen. When she screams that little Debbie's gonna have her a baby, it triggers a sense of horror in Mrs. Reilly, who probably thinks a baby is the worst thing a woman could ever have, bursting wildly into tears, causing Mr. Robichaud to take her maroon head and place it carefully on his shoulder. Another character that I briefly mentioned earlier is Myrna Minkoff, who's a friend from Ignatius' college days and a political activist. She diagnoses Ignatius as being sexually repressed. She writes in a letter to him, quote, a good explosive orgasm would cleanse your being and bring you out of the shadows. She sees Ignatius as having wasted potential living in New Orleans with his mother. There's an interesting tension between these two as Ignatius espouses his prudish morality in resistance to Myrna's suggestions of sexual liberation. The absurdity of both of their stances seem exaggerated and extreme, adding to the overall comedy of the novel. We can also indirectly blame Myrna for his getting fired from Levy Pants, as Ignatius felt he needed to rival the fervor of one of her political protests. I'm not convinced that Myrna is a great influence on Ignatius. She sees him as her personal project rather than treating him like a true friend would. Annoyingly, she's constantly giving him unsolicited advice, pushing him toward some type of love affair that's supposed to transform him. But I don't see her as helpful at all to Ignatius, despite what she calls his personality problems. Their back and forth communication is highly dysfunctional as Ignatius claps back at her. The comments upon my personal life were uncalled for and revealed a shocking lack of taste and decency. Actually, my personal life has undergone a metamorphosis. I am currently connected in a most vital manner with the food merchandising industry, and therefore I doubt quite seriously whether I shall have much time in the future to correspond with you. Busily, Ignatius. It's almost like Ignatius feels he has to one-up Myrna to prove her wrong about him, cleverly covering up his situation by making it seem like he's busy being a vital part of the, quote, food merchandising industry. Eventually, Ignatius teams up with George by allowing him to pay Ignatius to store his bags of pornographic pictures in his hot dog stand. The comedy ensues when Ignatius sees what's in the packages. Oh my God, Ignatius stared at what he saw. Once in high school, someone had shown him a pornographic photograph, and he had collapsed against a water cooler, injuring his ear. This photograph was far superior. A nude woman was sitting on the edge of a desk next to a globe of the world. Ignatius becomes obsessed with the woman in the photo, thinking she must be highly educated since her face is behind a large book, again, which happens to be his own book, Boethius, The Consolation of Philosophy. And this is how it's revealed that Lana Lee isn't just peddling these photos, but creating them herself, using the globe and Ignatius' book as props. But Ignatius, of course, misreads what he's seeing, taking these props literally to mean that this woman must be, quote, some destitute woman intellectual, forced to do anything for $1 while sharing his good taste, and that he must meet this, quote, philosopher cast into a hostile century by forces beyond her control, as he pockets the card for himself. And when he connects the address on the packaging to Night of Joy, he goes there in hopes of meeting this woman. Outside of Night of Joy, Jones asks Ignatius, how come a white cat like you talking so good selling weenies? Ignatius responds, I suspect that I am the result of particularly weak conception on the part of my father. His sperm was probably emitted in a rather offhand manner. It's an interesting answer since the father is absent throughout the novel with no explanation. And maybe this is part of the problem with Ignatius, and we get a hint that he does at least subconsciously blame his father for his plight. Jones is the only person in the novel who recognizes the injustice of a society that does not fairly compensate people like Ignatius for their education, saying he should have a, quote, good job, big Buick, air condition, and color TV. And while Ignatius tries to make his employment situation sound favorable, calling it, quote, pleasant outdoor work with no supervision, Jones argues that if he had gone to college, he would not be working as a hot dog vendor selling, quote, garbage. Ignatius dismisses Jones' opinions since he is not in a position to question his occupation while working at Night of Joy. Jones explains to him that he doesn't like working there and how he wants to end up someplace better with gainful employment and a living wage. Ignatius, not really understanding Jones's plight, simply tries to correct his point of view, arguing that his wanting to be part of the bourgeois only illustrates his being brainwashed. While I do agree that it may not be such a great aspiration to be what Ignatius would probably call today a normie of the middle class, at the same time he again, out of arrogance, misappropriates the plight of Jones as if he knows better than he what he should or should not aspire to, while ignoring the socioeconomic constraints placed on him. I read Jones as the most clear-eyed and grounded character in the novel, and possibly the most aligned with Toole himself, who is trying to expose the indifference of society toward marginalized groups in 1960s New Orleans. Thinking that the woman in the photograph would be appearing in Night of Joy, Ignatius, convinced by Jones that it would be the finest act he'd ever seen, plans to see the show. Before he departs the scene, he again criticizes Jones, saying his judgments are all wrong and that when he gets to the top, he'll have a nervous breakdown. There is some truth to what he's saying, only in the sense that living in a capitalistic society is hard, even if you are middle class, and the psychological and physical toll may be worse than someone like Jones could imagine. However, I think Ignatius' recommendation that Jones read Boethius is again misplaced. Where I agree with Ignatius is that yes, we shouldn't put materialistic values on a pedestal, but because he puts himself on a pedestal, his words never really inspire the people that he gives advice to. Jones blows a cloud of smoke in his direction, telling him to come see the dancing of Darlene, whom he nicknames Scarlet O'Horror. But when Ignatius sits by the stage, he only sees Darlene with her cockatoo getting her one line wrong. "Oh my God," Ignatius bellowed, unable to remain silent any longer. "Is this cretin Harlot O'Hara?" The chaos ensues from there as the cockatoo attacks Ignatius' hoop earring as he knocks over tables on his way out the door into the path of an oncoming bus, ending with Ignatius lying passed out in the street. Quote, he would have fallen directly before the bus if Jones hadn't leaped into the street and pulled at the white smock with his two large hands. Ignatius instead fell backward in the bus, exhaling diesel exhaust rumbled past an inch or two from his desert boots. It is soon after this that an undercover Mancuso puts Lana under arrest for soliciting and for possession of pornography. Mancuso is comically celebrated by the sergeant for breaking up the quote pornography racket. Despite his successful sabotage of Alana Lee, Jones is out of a job with the Night of Joy, now out of business. It wasn't a part of his plan, now seeing Ignatius as the equivalent of a nuclear bomb, destroying everyone around him. He knows finding another job will be difficult for him. On the bright side, the police are more appreciative of Jones, helping them nab Lana, and Mr. Levy intends to give Jones an award and an offer of employment after seeing him in the paper over Ignatius, the quote, fallen idealist. But his motive for this is that it would be good for public relations. Once the picture of Ignatius lying in the street comes out in the newspaper, his career as a hot dog vendor is finished and his mother disgraced. In Ignatius' typical way of coping, he blames Miss Trixie for the forged letter, again dodging responsibility and getting himself off the hook. Mr. Levy figures out it was Ignatius who wrote the letter, but decides to pin it on Miss Trixie since he can get her off the hook by declaring her incompetent. While Mr. Levy's mind state seems more reactionary instead of proactive, his entire career is one of reluctance and scorn, a career he never asked for. But he does seem to do the right thing when his hand is forced, albeit one that is pragmatic and self-serving at times. In the final scene, Myrna comes to rescue Ignatius from the ambulance coming to take him to the psych ward. Although she expects them to have a great time in New York, it is doubtful their plan is going to work out, as before they even leave, she wonders why Ignatius has to sit in the back of the car. She worries she's making a big mistake once she realizes he's his, quote, old horrible self. It wouldn't surprise me if Myrna ends up as exasperated with Ignatius as his mother. We get confirmation that Ignatius has not given up on Fortuna, wondering where she will spin him now. As I usually do in my reviews, I always try to look for ways to empathize with the characters in the book because I think it's a good practice, especially in today's times where empathy seems to be lacking. I can relate to being in the same situation as Ignatius, since my initiation into the working world after graduating with an English degree did not go well. I ended up bagging groceries part-time and even taking on seasonal employment with UPS, who unfortunately never called me back for full-time work. I know also how embarrassing it can feel to be overeducated while working jobs that are far below one's potential while offering no real intellectual rewards. As his problems multiply and his life trajectory goes downhill, Ignatius does begin to become disillusioned at times, calling Fortuna depraved and a, quote, vicious slut. He calls the Book of Fortuna itself bad luck once he discovers how it was used in the production of Lana's pornographic cards. Ignatius' tale is tragic once we realize that he doesn't fit into the working world as his mother acknowledges in their last scene together. You was right, Ignatius. You can't go to work. I should have known that. I should have tried to get that debt paid off some other way. Just like so many college graduates in the wake of this novel, Ignatius is never truly prepared to go out into the world and contribute to society in a meaningful way. It's sad that by the end of the novel, Ignatius' mother believes she cannot take care of her son and that the best place for him is in the psychiatric ward at Charity. It's a sad truth and part of what makes Ignatius both a tragic and comic figure. There is one point in the story where Mrs. Reilly tells Ignatius to go to his room and, quote, write some more of your foolishness. It must have been lines like this that inspired Toole's mother to push hard for the publication of this, quote, foolish novel that has a lot to say about those who don't fit into society and end up failing simply because they don't share the same values. And as I mentioned before, I did wonder after reading this story where Ignatius' father was the whole time and what happened to him. Could that have anything to do with Ignatius' character and how he views the world? It's so normalized for men these days to not have fathers present in their upbringing that I almost completely missed it in my reading of it. But I do think that paternal influence could have helped shape Ignatius' character in more positive ways, like learning to take responsibility for his actions instead of just paying lip service to them through a false sense of moral superiority. But because his father's not present, we can only wonder how Ignatius would have turned out. Mrs. Reilly's words toward her son sting. You learned everything, Ignatius, except how to be a human being. Mr. Levy seems to be the only person that even comes close to something like a father figure, seeing Mrs. Reilly as a dictator telling her to leave Ignatius alone. He thinks, quote, this Reilly woman wouldn't even give her own child a chance. She was as bad as his wife. No wonder Reilly was such a wreck. While I don't totally buy Mr. Levy's assessment of their relationship, he does recognize that Ignatius is not in a mentally healthy space. Not that he is in a position to fix their relationship since he has marital problems of his own. Beyond being comical, Ignatius is also a frustrating character because I share some of the same thoughts and struggles he has while watching him destroy his credibility while floundering in his attempts toward constructive social change in society. I can only guess that Toole's real intention was to ridicule Ignatius to show that having an attitude of self aggrandizement while displaying hypocrisy through one's actions is not the best way to have a meaningful impact on society. As soon as I try to relate to Ignatius, he does something to lose my empathy. So it's a frustrating journey if I am to gain something from this novel beyond its entertainment value. So while I'm not here to judge Ignatius, I am simply pointing out that in real life, people like Ignatius are not easy to work with or get along with, but that's exactly why he's such an entertaining character. While the book does critique society also, it's more a focused critique on how not to set yourself above an imperfect society and thinking that you'll get good results by doing so. Instead, we have to be engaged with the world, often in ways we may not want to, but simply judging the world is not enough. We have to be able to work and communicate with others while trying to find common ground. If we can't do that, we end up like Ignatius, isolated and disconnected in our own world while being unempathetic to the people around us. If you made it this far, congratulations. I hope it was worth it. If you have anything to add, let me know in the comments. What do you think of Ignatius? Did you like the book as a whole? Is there more to be learned from the book than what I covered? And here's a question for you. Why aren't more books like this published? Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.